So, welcome to lecture number 7 in our series of looking into knowledge integration and collective intelligence. And this lecture will be about the relationship between knowledge, learning, and social climate. So, the fundamental issue here is if you remember this shell of truths that we have been talking about, you understand that all the knowledge we have and use, you could say, is within this shell of truths, and that's the same frame of reference that we use when we experience and interpret things, words, people, everything around us. And this, of course, means that it's the same shell we use when we experience ourselves. We all have an idea of ourselves and our identity and our skills and our position in society, family, groups, and so on. Now, if you think about this and realize that everything we experience is something that we interpret through a frame of reference, you also realize that every time we do experience something and we want to understand it, it is a result not only of what we're looking at, but also this frame of reference. It means that we have actually 2 points in which we can adjust things in order to interpret what we experience. It means that we don't necessarily experience at first the things we see, but we can also change our perception of it. And that's exactly what we do. A lot of time what I'm saying is that we actually experience what we want to experience. So in psychology, there are lots of different theories on this, of course, but one important understanding of how people function is that what we want to feel is basically 3 things. It's some form of self-appreciation that we can sort of, well, if not love ourselves, at least like ourselves or in some way appreciate ourselves. It's something we call self-efficacy, which is basically the feeling that we are able to manage the situations we are in, that we have some kind of control, we have some kind of ability to survive, basically. And the third thing is continuity. Continuity is to see how things sort of ended up where I am right now. I can follow how things have developed and why I'm here and why this is happening. And now if you think about a person that for some reason has a disturbance in one of these 3 factors, that is sort of when he or she looks at it, it says that no, something's wrong here. I cannot appreciate myself, or I cannot see that I'm functioning where I am, or I cannot see how I ended up here. That would be quite an issue. That person will have problems feeling, good or comfortable, of course. So you could say that one way of looking at this is that we as human beings sort of try to protect these 3 understandings of ourselves. And one way of protecting it is, of course, to adopt this shell of truths or the frame of reference so that I can feel these 3 things. This is, of course, nothing we do, deliberately or with conscious, but it's a way of understanding why people can do things that from an external point of view seems very strange in the long run. Like if you want me to take an example, you could say, suppose you're a person who grows up in an environment where you've been taught and raised with the idea that profit is something bad. Your family is whatever has that opinion, or the environments where you are working or learning or whatever has this opinion. And then for some reason, when you're about 30 years old or so, someone is saying something that's starting to convince you that maybe this is wrong, maybe profit isn't such a bad thing after all. So for the first time, when you're like 30, 35, you're really listening to someone who says that, profit is not a bad thing. What would that mean? Well, it would probably mean that you would have to reevaluate a lot of the things you have done, a lot of choices you have made, lots of things you have said, and so on. So in this little example, just to illustrate that learning things isn't necessarily a comfortable thing, and we have mechanisms, defense mechanisms, to work with this so that we don't really have to learn. If you understand what I mean. Okay, now if we look at this, these relationships between learning and emotions and so on, we can sort of move this into the group environment. And there's some research done to sort of try to create a model of how this works at group level. And you could say, in one way of looking at this, you could say that depending on task complexity, you would have to develop the relationships of the group to different levels. Well, simply, if you're going to do something very simple together, well, maybe you don't need to have that strong relations, because the things you're doing is rather explanatory in themselves and so on. But the more complex things you are going to work with, it will mean you have to have more deeper levels of knowledge integration. It would also mean that in order to enable this knowledge integration, you would have to develop the relationships of the group. And basically at the bottom of this are those defensive mechanisms I was talking about earlier, that people don't necessarily want to see things in the way that they may initially perceive them, and then there's always this option of adjusting what you're experiencing by reinterpret it through your frame of reference. And this model is called the Trust Openness Spiral. It's developed by Anders Wendelheim at the Stockholm University, and it's one way of explaining this. So you understand that the more complex things you're working with, the more you have to develop the trust level of the group. And the best way of developing trust is by openness, by increasing the openness of the group. However, there will be some mechanisms trying to sort of stop this from happening. It's the group version of these defensive mechanisms that all people have. But in groups, it will mean that if it starts to be sensitive and I'm starting to understand things in a way that I don't, maybe I'm not prepared to see, well, we have different forms that could be denial, simplification of things in the group, so that we don't have to go down there and develop this understanding. It could be that we start addressing symptoms, things that are sort of, temporarily fixing things but not really solving the problem. It could be people turning from group focus to more personal gain and start sub-optimizing. Or it could be just, staying on, repeating the problems, repeating the analysis, but not really moving the group into joint understanding, but sort of staying in fixed patterns of arguments and suggested solutions and so on. And all these four examples are examples of how this process of creating deeper understanding, addressing the more of the complexity, but also needing higher levels of openness and trust could be interrupted, and therefore the group becomes finally unable to deal with the problem. Okay, so some other theories that's been working with sort of the same issue here, why people learn and why they don't learn and so on, is I'm very famous for it, is Argyris and Schoen. And they're explaining the same thing basically in what they call defensive behavior, and that's what I've been talking about. So unfortunately, what they say is that the standard behavior of people in organizations is something they call Model 1. So basically they're saying that the standard behavior of people in organizations is defensive. And you can understand this in the following way, that when we work in large complex organizations, we meet a lot of new people, we're working with new difficult things all the time, there's certain stress level and so on. There's a lot of uncertainty. And the way we deal with this uncertainty is to sort of remain as much as possible in control. And one of the most important things then to remain in control is to defend your shell of truths. That means that if you create a new group with a number of new participants, they've never been working together and so on, what you should expect is basically to see defensive behavior from them. And now how does that work? Well, the basic issue here is, as I said, is to remain as much as in control as possible. But while you're doing that, you would also see people trying to show a positive attitude or a nice, feeling within the group. So people would be sort of polite and send the expected signals of having a positive attitude towards things. But at the same time, their brains are sort of working on how to see that they don't expose themselves too much in this situation, which means perhaps not to reveal too much of what you're thinking and what you see as problems and so on, because if you do, that means you sort of leaving part of your shell of truth out for exposure and also then possibly being questioned. And it means that if you're in this state, we don't know really what kind of mean and end rationality the people, present have individually. So, and we're not really trying to dig into that either with this defensive behavior. And this explains why teams can remain working together for quite a long time. Actually, they could lock their pattern to this and keep up for years. That in a way that where it seems that they're cooperating and doing what they're supposed to, but they're not really exposing the core of the situation and aligning their different thoughts, but they're just sort of upholding a surface of cooperation. So what this means is, if we have this group of people in a defensive mode, it means that when people start saying things that you perceive as, well, not something you want to hear, you can always work with your sort of shell of truth and turn that into explanation, saying either that, okay, this person doesn't really understand things, that's why he or she is saying the wrong things, sort of, according to you. Or if you have a bad relationship with this person, you can even go further than that and explain it as something wrong with this person. It's a person you don't like, and that, to most of us, that's enough. If we end up in this mode, well, it basically tells us that we don't have to listen to him or her. So it means that if we start off with this defensive behavior and we are not able to break this and things start turning bad, we can have these negative spirals where the next step will be sort of us continue working with different problem settings because we're not really agreeing on a common one, which in turn means that we will have even more difficulties in understanding each other because what other people do and say doesn't make sense in your problem setting. This you in turn have to explain as to yourself as some character of the individuals in the group, which probably means you're gonna start describing them to yourself in a negative way, maybe even the group, which of course convince you that this defensive behavior is the right thing here in this group because it's it's all gone wrong and you need to protect yourself. And this means at the end that things are perceived as being not good and not going the right way, and you can find all the explanations you need in faults of other people, basically saying that you're doing the right thing, you don't have to change anything, but it's the circumstances or the other people that are sort of making this impossible to have a good development of this group. However, this is like a spiral where things sort of start enforcing each other and supporting each other, but it can also be turned, and it can of course be turned in many different ways. Since groups and collective intelligence is a dynamic phenomena, and we're here sort of digging into what the different factors are, you can understand that all these factors in a dynamic phenomena can, if they're changed, start changing the pattern of the group. So one way, of course, is reversing this process by some kind of facilitation and what Argyes and Schoen calls a Model 2 behavior, which is basically where a group is much more listening to each other, trying to understand other people's perceptions and understandings, working with the difference between problem setting and problem solving, so that if things are wrong, we start discussing here, or do we possibly have different problem settings, and we can start working with that. That was what previously was called double loop learning. We start looking into our assumptions and the conditions we implicitly have for looking at things. So that would be one way. Another way would be to develop the way we communicate, the way we talk, the way we listen, the way we ask questions. So we change the communicative pattern of the group. Or it could be actually like this trust openness spiral suggests, that instead of working with the sort of cognitive problem of the situation, we start working with the social climate of the group, just with the purpose of warming up the group, getting better social relations, which would change the way we talk to each other. And finally, one individual can always break a pattern, since the pattern is people starting to respond to each other in a way that becomes a pattern. It means that any single individual, by not responding the way that the pattern suggests or expects, it would actually change the whole balance of this pattern, so that it could take another turn. That's no guarantee for it taking a turn that you want, but it sort of at least destabilize the existing pattern. So if we summarize this lecture number 7 on sort of how knowledge, learning and relationship sort of relates to each other, you could say that knowledge is tied to the individual and his or her perception of him or herself, our identity, which makes knowledge integration into a sensitive and risky process in the way I explained, which means also that humans are generally careful in both sharing and receiving knowledge. The way people respond to each other, the social climate, affects the perceived risk in this process. So the climate in itself, you could say, regulate what level of knowledge integration this group will be able to work on. People respond to each other from different social action strategies. That's what Argus and Schoen call these things. Our espoused theory about how we behave tells us that we are open and receptive to knowledge. That's sort of the perception of ourselves that we uphold. But our theory in use, what we actually do, show that we are much more careful and focused on remaining in control and preserving a positive self-image rather than actually considering new knowledge. We are protecting our shell of truths. People's predisposed understanding, or what you could say, their prejudices, is an important starting point for how they will respond to each other. That's our reflex starting point. The knowledge of these defensive behavior and our social theory in use tells us that we obstruct listening and it will obstruct listening and prevent erroneous understandings from being corrected if we end up in these negative spirals. It will impede the ability to find productive problem settings and drive us towards premature problem solving. And at the end, it may generate vicious circles that aggravates communication and knowledge integration and sort of lock down the group into unintelligent behavior. Now, these vicious communicative circles can be reversed either through what you could say forced in Model 2 behavior or some kind of facilitation where you actually break down what's happening and try in a sort of technical or methodological way to reverse this process. It could also change by understanding the communicative pattern and work with that so that you deliberately start increasing the way people inquire into the situation, asking questions, listening, and so on. Or you could reverse it by just working with the social climate of the group and try to increase the relations and the openness within the group. Or, as I said, any single individual can, if a group is locked down in a certain pattern, on their own try to change this pattern. And whatever they do that is sort of falls out of the pattern, it will destabilize the pattern. This, of course, as I said, is no guarantee for things leading in a certain direction, but it's always an option. That's important to remember. It's people that uphold these patterns, so that also means that people can always change them. So that was it. That was lecture 7. Thank you.